Hello, everyone. Jory here, co-host of the Exit Light podcast on the Exit Light channel. And today I've been asked by Exit Light to step in for her as she is recovering from her recent illness and keep you folks entertained. So I went and pulled a book off of my shelf called I Never Believed in Ghosts Until 100 Real Life Encounters. And these are supposedly true stories of the paranormal that were submitted to the editors of the USA Weekend. So, kick back, relax, and let us begin. The following story was submitted by Janet L. Hernandez, and it is entitled The Haunted Ford. In 1960, it was almost impossible to find a good used car for less than $500. With a little help from Dad, I found a 1952 Ford Crestline Victoria, a black and white customized hardtop with a working push-button radio, a bargain at $275. Since I had recently graduated from high school, money was hard to come by, so I borrowed $250 from Mom and Dad. As soon as I started to work, I would begin to pay off the debt in weekly installments. Any 17-year-old would agree that a new car had to be spotless, so Dad and I proceeded to wash and wax my purchase. While buffing the door on the passenger side, we noticed 3 holes that had been plugged with some sort of patch and repainted. These holes looked like bullet holes, but we didn't care. The car ran pretty well and looked great. While we were riding around the block on one of our first outings in the car, the vehicle's passenger door flew open. We didn't think much of it and took the car to the garage for a repair. The mechanic couldn't find anything wrong with it, so he didn't charge us. The following week, my sister and I were riding around when the same thing happened. As soon as we arrived home, I told Dad. He checked the door catch over again, but still couldn't find anything wrong. The third time it happened, we were driving about 40 miles per hour next to a cemetery. Still, we didn't give it much thought. The fourth time the door flew open, we were also going about 40 miles per hour, this time next to a different cemetery. It was now becoming clear that something strange was going on. We decided to have the oil changed, so we took the car to our local garage. While the car was up on the lift, we noticed that some of the wires had been fastened to the underside of the car to hold up some of the pipes. This car had been in some sort of mishap. Our bargain was turning into a real mystery. The mechanic secured the wires and added new clamps to the exhaust system. The oil change completed, we went for a spin. This time we were going 50 miles per hour when the passenger door flew open. Have you ever tried to push a door open at that speed? It's pretty difficult. At that point, we decided that the car was haunted. Someone was most likely killed in it in a shootout. We made the decision to trade it in. Meanwhile, Dad tied the passenger door shut with a heavy rope, winding it around the seat and through the door handle. He was following me home when just in front of the little church near the center of town, door flew open, rope and all. There is a cemetery behind that church. That was our last encounter with our ghost because the car was sold an hour later for $650, another bargain. We never heard any more about the 1952 Ford, and I never saw it again. Perhaps the ghost had had its last ride. The next story is called Seance by B. Elaine Story. White candles were lit to keep bad spirits from intruding, and black plastic had been taped over the windows. With the exception of a few curious newcomers, everyone expected nothing less than communication with the dead. Each progressive seance had produced enough coincidences to make even a doubting Thomas a believer. The room was filled with teenagers. News had spread around town, and parties that had started out as typical teenage get-togethers with the added fascination of the supernatural as entertainment had become so intriguing and so mystifying that no one wanted to stop the seances until much more had been accomplished. After all, everyone was just having fun. On this particular night, the group decided to call back a guy named Nicky, who had died a few years earlier from leukemia at the age of 27. He really had no claim to fame. He simply happened to be dead. He had been friends with some members of the audience, and almost everyone else had known him or knew of him because we lived in a small town. The main practitioners of the seance placed their hands on the Ouija board's dial. Different kids from the crowd asked questions. The first few were simple and factual. What was your wife's name? What year did you graduate from high school? The few people who knew Nikki well posed questions of more specific nature, with answers only the questioner would know. Every question was answered correctly, and was followed by a silence from the amazed audience. One skeptic asked Nikki to give a physical sign as evidence that a connection had truly been made. The Ouija dial spelled out that they would receive a sign at midnight, and hands jerked away from the board as people looked at each other with eyes sick with the joy of fear. A certain energy was shared by all in the room, an energy that bound them together. At midnight, the sound of a loud, rumbling motorcycle racing down the street outside broke the silence. The teenagers scrambled out of their chairs and rushed to the windows, but no one saw a bike. That was a Harley-Davidson. Nikki owned the baddest Harley in the county. We checked each other's facial expressions. Some of the girls unconsciously covered their mouths with their hands. Others tried to offer some logical explanation to ears already prejudiced against the reason. What they all had witnessed through the sight and sound was all they needed to satisfy the obvious conclusion, even if the obvious was beyond explanation. Still, one determined guest had to make it vocal. Ask if that was Nikki's bike. No one was surprised when the Ouija dial flew upward to yes. The dial then started moving without the prompting of a question and began to spell out this message: "Meet me at my grave." For some, this was too much to consider, but for most, it was an invitation too much to refuse. It was as if the final answer lay at the Concord Methodist churchyard. Few hesitated to jump into their cars and drive the 8 miles across narrow, winding roads to the destination suggested by the Ouija. Upon arrival at the cemetery, the crowd set out for Nikki's grave. Even though it was midsummer, there was something chilling in the damp, foggy air, something that lashed their faces and whispered in their ears. The incessant sound of crickets became a monotonous torment as no one dared to utter a sound, given the solemnity of their purpose. When the first group came within sight of the grave, they froze in their steps, either from disbelief or from facing cold reality. No one came within 20 feet of Nikki's final resting place, because those who looked through the moonlit haze saw a dim, shadowy figure sitting on Nikki's tombstone, arms outstretched to greet them. They ran back to their cars, slipping on wet grass, panting, their hearts pounding. Days later, the parents of some of the kids casually remarked how strange it was that they had seen a tall, thin man walking down Chapel Avenue around midnight, wearing a gray, pinstripe suit. Nikki had been buried in a gray, pinstripe suit. Our next story is titled Nightly Ritual by Kathleen Taylor. They say there are no such things as ghosts, but we sometimes wonder why incidents such as those I'm about to relate occur. When I was 8 years old, my mother saw a man standing in our kitchen at about 1 o'clock every morning. He would slowly remove his suit coat, put it on a hanger, and hang it on the dish closet door. My parents' bedroom was off the kitchen, and she could see the dish closet from her bed. After a few nights of viewing this ritual, she told my father that she was seeing someone in the kitchen every night. She would not tell him what the man was doing. She insisted instead that the next night she would wake my father to see whether he saw anything and, if he did see something, to describe what it was. When the man next appeared, my mother poked my father to wake him. The two of them sat up in bed and watched the man go through his nightly motions. My father related to my mother exactly what he saw, the same thing she had been witnessing for several nights. The next day, my mother told her aunt, who lived downstairs in the same house, about seeing the man. Her aunt had seen him too, and her description of him fit perfectly. My grand-aunt said that this man had lived in our rooms before we moved in. It seems he used to work from 4 p.m. until midnight and got home from work each night at about 1 a.m., the same time that my mother was seeing the apparition. She further added that he always hung his coat on the dish closet door instead of in the bedroom so as not to disturb his wife. She told my mother that she had heard that his ashes were still somewhere in our rooms. For quite some time, my mother and father continued to see the man and learned not to let him bother them. One day, my mother was cleaning the living room windows and curtains. She had taken down the shades and was sitting on the couch talking to her cousin. They saw the sunlight from the bare windows shining into the open metal grillwork on the front panel of the old fireplace. My mother thought that there was dust in the fireplace and took off the metal panel and swept it out. After this was done, the man never appeared again. My mother finally realized that she had found his ashes. It hadn't been dust in the fireplace after all. Our next story is entitled The Blue House Dress by Virginia Stone. It was a warm, sultry summer evening in 1943, and my father, a young boy, was disturbed in his sleep. He opened his eyes and peeped over the edge of his covers. He knew it was late because he could not hear any of his family moving around or talking downstairs. He glanced at the window where a slight breeze was rustling the sheer draperies of his bedroom. The old 3-story house creaked in familiar ways, and, with a sigh, Jimmy rolled over to go back to sleep. Suddenly, something made him look toward the doorway. Standing on the threshold was the figure of a woman wearing his mother's favorite blue house dress. Startled, he called out, "Mother!" There was no answer. The figure did not move. At this, Jimmy dived under his sheet and trembled with fright. Then, to his horror, he felt a slight pressure on the edge of his bed, as if someone had sat down in the corner. After this moment, my father remembered nothing until he awoke to see the sunlight streaming into his room the next morning. Jimmy ran downstairs to tell his parents about what he had encountered during the night. He frantically told his father about the figure in the doorway. My grandfather just laughed and continued with his breakfast. Jimmy approached his mother and asked whether she had entered his bedroom the previous night. After all, the figure was wearing her blue house dress. My grandmother assured my father that she certainly was not the mysterious figure in the doorway. Throughout breakfast, my father was silent and barely touched his food. He knew he had not dreamt the episode. It was very real, and yet no one believed him. After breakfast, my grandmother took my father upstairs to her large walk-in closet on the 3rd floor. She wanted to reassure her son that he had in fact dreamed the entire sequence. She would prove this by finding her blue house dress. She was confident that this would ease Jimmy's mind. Upstairs, both my father and my grandmother rummaged through the large closet. They checked every clothing hanger and hooked. The blue house dress had vanished. To this day, my grandmother has never found her house dress, and my father has never learned the identity of the mysterious visitor. Next we have Did I Lock the Basement Door? By Laura Guinan. On a cold, snowy night, I was curled up on my sofa watching television, waiting for my husband to come home from work. My 2 babies were upstairs, asleep in their cribs. We had just moved into the middle apartment of a 7-family row house. I was so proud of our new home. The downstairs consisted of the living room, dining room, and kitchen, all in a row. A house with this layout is often called a shotgun house because a gun, shot through the front door, would send a bullet right through to the back door. Each of the 3 rooms downstairs had a door. The living room had the front door, the kitchen had the back door, and the center room, which I used as a dining room, had a door to the basement. Even the basement had a door that led to the outside. The apartment had been the scene of a gruesome murder-suicide. It seems that the lady of the house, who used the center room as a den, was shot dead by her husband one day as she watched television. In the quiet of that night, I slowly became aware of heavy footsteps deliberately climbing the stairs from the basement. My first thought was that some patient had escaped from the nearby mental hospital. Had I locked the basement door? We had no phone yet. My babies were upstairs, defenseless except for me. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a bookend, and waited for someone to open the door to the basement. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The doorknob turned slowly, but the door did not open. I felt as if time stood still. My fear blocked out all sounds, and I could hear only my heart pounding like a bass drum. My arms ached from holding the bookend above my head. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. With one hand, I held the bookend, and with the other, I reached over and yanked open the door. It had been unlocked. No one was there. No snowy footprints on the stairs. I ran down and opened the door that led outside. No footprints in the snow either. The next day, I told the story to my neighbor, who had lived next door when the previous tenant shot his wife and then himself. I laughed and said, "Boy, am I glad I know he came in through the kitchen door." "Oh no," she replied. "He came up the basement stairs."